Okay, so I have to use the mic of my other headset because the webcam it picks up so loud. So um, and I don't want to change the connections in the back. 'Cause I'm lazy, so I'm just gonna be holding this. and okay, anyway. So I'm gonna be responding to this video by Blue Spectacles. I took some notes down. I was thinking I might like write it out or something, but I feel a bit lazy. So I thought I'll just sort of play it and respond.
Nice day out. Anyway, let me go over here. This wind. Anyway, this is a response. I had a video which was discussing why I'm not an antinatalist, and I discussed how I'm a theist. I would like to point out that I'm actually a Christian theist, so that even makes it more contradictory for me to be a antinatalist right now. But I discussed, like, even if I was an atheist, I still would not be antinatalist.
Okay, now, yes, antinatalists are atheists. Um, that is true. Um, but I just sort of made a point where if you believe there is such a thing as hell, if you're a Christian, then wouldn't that go through your head? Like if I have a kid, then the kid has the potentiality of going to hell and suffering for for eternity. So maybe for that reason, perhaps people shouldn't have children if they are Christians, because their child might go to hell. But anyway, so that's just another point. Just I thought it's sort of I've heard some people talk about it, but you're right. You have to be an atheist if you want to logically go, be an antinatalist.
And My Misery and Me posted a response to my video where he kind of pointed out a few things, which was really good. He kind of discussed how, for one thing, he kind of discussed how we have to keep separate reasons as to why to continue my own life, as to reasons why I should procreate or not procreate. And that's a very good distinction. However, I do have some thoughts on it. I mean, that is a good thing, because it is a good distinction to make. However, I do have a thought on it. But lots of people who are not antinatalist, I was one of them, will say how atheists, well, why don't you just kill yourself, or stuff like that, or how, I mean, stuff like that, like.
Yeah, well, well, there are a couple of reasons why people don't kill themselves. One of them is the fact that taking your own life is a psychologically challenging process, and we don't have stuff like euthanasia available, which will make it like, you'll be, you know, the medically assisted version. It might give the death a little bit more. You'll take a lot of the stress, perhaps, out of the dying process. Um, but the second reason is, you know, killing yourself is not going to fix the problem because people are still going to procreate. So the only way to stop procreation is to advocate for antinatalism and tell people why they shouldn't procreate so future people aren't imposed into existence where they will suffer or where they will hate their own lives, and you know so in order to stop the procreation from happening, you have to uh, tell the people who are doing it to not do it. So that's another reason.
And then, like, you even point out that, even with your antinatalist position, that you would still be able to, that you are still able to, make the best out of what you have, and just not procreate anymore, and not impose on any more lives this suffering and such.
Um, Yeah, it is a challenge to try and make the best of your life. You know, well, it depends on the person, I guess, but I defined it challenging. The futility of existence and all of that can really get to you. But I think, yeah, you can find ways to get around that, like set goals and do the best we can. Like
But I guess what else? And then at the end, you were kind of discussing. Well, actually, I discussed how I thought that. Well, I read the book David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been. That's one of the better, or that's probably one of the best books on antinatalism. He gives a pretty good logical argument there. He discusses suffering and sorry, this getting close to 4th of July fireworks. So it's like 10 a.m. fireworks already. Um, um, I discussed how I thought it was logical, and I think it is logical. And however, even though I still think it's logical, I don't think that I don't really want to be antinatalist even still. Um, and he said that, well, if he and my misery in me says, if you think that the argument is logical, then there should be nothing keeping you, given that you are a atheist. There should be nothing keeping you from becoming antinatalist.
yeah, I mean, but that's the point here. Because what atheism, what does that mean? It means you accept evolution as the origins of life. You accept that there is no afterlife or anything like that. So all of these sentient beings are here to consume, reproduce, and propagate a DNA molecule, and it's ultimately all going to extinct anyway. So since there is no need for us to be here, and since the price that we pay for existence is a lot of suffering and deprivation, and pleasure is just satisfaction of these needs, it seems rational that if you accept those premises, that the most logical and ethical thing to do is to not perpetuate life and find a way to bring it down gracefully. So atheism has certain premises that force us to, you know, logically conclude that this is the most rational way to go forward. So, so if you're an atheist, there are some consequences to that belief or that truth. There's nothing redemptive about life. There's no reward or anything like that. Like the theist might say, "Oh well, we'll go to heaven or whatever," but for the atheist, it's nothing like that. So it's just yeah, there has to be that's the conclusion that yeah, life is an imposition and we shouldn't perpetuate it.
So yeah, pretty much the whole discussion here is setting aside my Christian theism. It's setting aside that, and like that's pretty much where I started in my video. I was like, well, if I were atheist, then I would not be nihilist either. And he's saying that pretty much, well, if you think that the argument is logical, then there should be nothing keeping you from being a nihilist. So
Yeah, the argument can be logical. Yeah, but the premises have to. It's not just about the logical steps that you're following. It's about the premises as well. So if the premises are true, that there is no God and evolution is our origins and it's just replication and suffering is bad. If those premises are true, then the logical uh, argument you can make from those premises will lead us to conclude that antinatalism is what we should adopt. So it's not just about the logic of the steps, but it also has to do with whether the premises are true. So like I think you sort of allude to this later on. Yeah, a theist might have a logical kind of argument, but if their premises are false, then their conclusion, you know, is false. So it's about the premises being true as well. You have to have the premises right. So if an atheist, if the premises are true, there is no God and all of that, then logically, this is where you have to go. No one has been able to say why they should have the right to have a child. Oh, if you're an atheist.
Pretty much, I think that first of all, like you say that you have reasons over here why to continue your own life, and then what should be separated from that is reasons to procreate or to not procreate. And first of all, I mean, I think that stuff that happens over here in your own life gives you quite a criterion as to whether or not to procreate. So
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's not like I'm completely separating it. I'm just saying that in order for you to live your own life or whatever, I mean, you can make that distinction logically and even for your psychological health. Um, Antinatalists aren't saying hate your own life. They're just saying don't procreate because you understand that life is a zero-sum game. So, yeah, that philosophical understanding is what informs our decision not to procreate. So, yeah, there is some connection between the two. But all I was trying to say is you don't have to hate your own life, even though you philosophically understand that life itself is not worthy. On a personal level, you can still make the best of it. Um, yeah.
Antinatalists often discuss a imposition metaphor. There's a gift in the imposition metaphor. Conference report and Professor Anton and
Anyway, yeah, I was interrupted, so sorry. Yeah.
um, and Mendham as well as lots of others have discussed these metaphors, and Antinatalists will discuss this imposition metaphor that when you bring somebody into the world, then you are imposing suffering on them, or that you're causing needless suffering, and pretty much the only way that you would arrive at saying that by procreating that you're causing needless suffering is if you have suffering and problems and all these bad things happen to you in your own life.
Well, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that you have personally suffered a lot for you to conclude that suffering is bad and then that there is no rational justification to impose these risks of suffering, some of them which can be horrific, on another sentient beings. So, for instance, let's take Benatar. He doesn't seem like he has suffered a lot in his life. I don't know his personally, but he certainly doesn't seem like someone who's had a really bad life or whatever up to this point. So, but he's still an antinatalist, you see, because you can see the suffering that exists in the world. You can understand that being in a pain or misery is not a good thing to be in, and you can recognize that there are a lot of people and a lot of animals, uh, put in all of these horrific states. So you don't have to have personally suffered to know that suffering is a bad thing. Um, the reason we're an antinatalist is because we can't find any rational justification to procreate and impose the risks of suffering on another sentient being. Like Benatar's asymmetry is very simple. If you have a child, they will suffer, and yes, they'll experience some pleasure. But if you don't have a child, they won't suffer, which is a good. You're preventing the suffering, and they won't have any need for the pleasure because they're not going to be. No one is there to be deprived of it. So it's a very simple argument. And the imposition, argument has to do with, like, whenever people have children, The child is imposed into life without their they don't have consent. They can't have consent to live this life. Um, and there are all these risks of suffering. You cannot predict beforehand whether your child will suffer a lot or not. You're taking a gamble with someone else's welfare. So those are some of the reasons why uh, we're an antinatalist. It's not just about saying suffering is bad. Yes, suffering is bad, but you're imposing all of these risks on another sentient being, another person, uh, and without their consent, and there's no reason to do it. See, you don't need to create suffering and put it on another person unless you had a good reason to do it, right? If you're going to bring suffering into the world, what is your reason for it? We wouldn't do it arbitrarily, so.
And that will lead you to make the connection to not procreate over here. So something happens to you in this life will give you criteria or reasons to not procreate in this area over here. So they are separated, I think, but there's reasons. But there's a link there. Um, so I guess I discussed in that video. There are people in my family and friends who are theists and atheists who have shown me a certain way to live, which is ways to get around my problems and suffering and such. There's ways to get around it.
Yeah, well, that's about finding ways to cope with your own life, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that because you're already here, and the people who are here, yes, there are various strategies that you can use. And I think later on you talk about the thing about suffering makes us develop character or something like that. Well, that may be true in some cases, and in some cases it may not be true. But either way, yeah, you can find ways to overcome some of the hardships that you will encounter in life. But again, antinatalists are not talking about your own life necessarily. They're talking about the fact that if you can recognize that yes, life is filled with hardships and there are all of these downside risks of suffering, and then if you're an atheist, one of the conclusions is that life is futile. It doesn't have any purpose or function. It's simply a manifestation of a DNA molecule, just a piece of chemistry, and that all of this is ultimately going to extinction anyway. So if you accept those statements as being true, why would I create a new person or new sentient being and bring them into existence and expose them to suffering? Some of those people who will suffer are going to suffer horrifically. If you get like a cancer as a child, it doesn't matter how much character you have. You're gonna still suffer horribly and die. Car accidents, diseases, and all of these things. Some of these instances of suffering, they're gonna destroy you. Even if you live through them, you're gonna have your quality of life is gonna suffer a lot. So yeah, I mean, if we accept that life is futile, it does never function, and it contains these risks of suffering, I don't see how you are justified in bringing another person here and exposing them to the risks. Yes, maybe most of them might cope with it, but some of them might not. And people kill themselves. About 1 million people kill themselves each year. So why? And a lot of people attempt suicide. So there's a lot of people are living miserable lives, and why do we need to put that on another person when we concede that as an atheist that life is futile?
Not not to get around it, but more like ways to manage it and still be happy and have a good life, and not be waiting for my life to be without problems and without suffering, to be happy, because there's always going to be suffering and problems. Um, so pretty much what I've seen is that there's ways to be happy and to have a good life uh, amidst all this suffering and all these bad things that are going to happen to a person.
Yeah, like I said, no, not. Well, sometimes it might not be possible. Some of the situations you come across, you might not be able to overcome them. Um, if you are in a car accident and if you lose function of your legs, or if you were paraplegic and you were on the bed all day, your quality of life is going to be so diminished. Even if you develop a lot of character or psychological strength, even if you have a lot of a supportive family or whatever, your quality of life is diminished as a fact. You would have done things not, before the accident that you cannot do now. So the risks of getting harmed in life are, some of them are not trivial. They can be really serious. So even though people adapt to changing circumstances, yeah, we can psychologically adapt to them. That doesn't mean that our quality of life hasn't been diminished. You can be successful and happy one day, and then a few months later, because of the economy falls, you might be broke and you know uh, struggle to find work, and you might, yeah, adapt to that situation. But there's no denying the fact that you're in a worse state than you were before when you were having a great job and friends and all of that. So people adapt, but the fact is their lives has gotten worse. So yeah.
So that is the reason, why I have obviously chosen to continue my own life. And I call this I did call this like maybe it was like 2 years ago. I made three videos which I called the art of existence, and I discussed a lot of things there. But one thing I would like to discuss right now that I discussed there was Marcel Proust, um, who said that he doesn't wish that his sufferings and problems of his past years were gone because they make him who he is now.
Yeah, that's that whole idea that what doesn't kill you can really make you stronger. Yeah, but sometimes what doesn't kill you can make you more miserable. Maybe maybe killing you would have been better than you surviving through some of these horrific things. People who fight in the war and come back, yeah, they can have, you know, post-traumatic disorder, and you look at some vets, and they have bad psychological experiences, and a lot of them suffer a lot. So it's not always the case that what doesn't kill you can make you stronger. So yeah, yeah,
And I believe that is true to an extent. That the things that all the bad things that happen to us here um, make us who we are, and there's a way to manage it. Not not I'm not trying to say that the suffering is small. I'm trying to say that there's a way to manage it, as to where you can still have all the suffering and still have a relatively happy life. Um,
yes, that you can do that. It is possible, but again, the question is, since life is futile, it doesn't have a function. Why would we impose the risks of suffering, some of which can be very horrific and debilitating, on another person? When people procreate, they're imposing the risks of suffering on another person. They're gambling with someone else's life. They're saying, "Oh well, I'm sort of doing okay right now, so I guess I'll have a child, and maybe my child will also have an okay life." Well, maybe your child has a different psychology than you. Maybe they might not want to adapt. Maybe they'll say, "Oh shit, I just can't stand this," and they might kill themselves. That's a possibility. Lots of kids do kill themselves. So um, the child is a different person. They're gonna become their own individual person. So You can't say that what I have come to believe or the strategies that have worked for me is going to work for them. So you're making a judgment for them, and then you're imposing them into life. But if you don't impose them into life, yeah, they're not going to experience life, but they're not going to be deprived of it either. There's no one in a state of non-existence saying, I want to be born. The safe option is to not procreate. Even if you procreate and the child ends up liking their life, we don't know. But since the risks of suffering can be great, and since there's no need for them to exist, it's more logical to not procreate, right?
This is arguable. There are people who do not agree with me on this. So I'm just saying that this is merely a difference on the difference of opinion here as to whether there is such art of existence, as to whether we can choose to, you know, have a happy life or not. Um,
Whether we can choose to have a happy life or not. I don't know what that means because most people will attempt to try and obtain some kind of comfort in their lives. I don't think that anyone chooses to be miserable, but misery and suffering are going to be imposed on you, whether you like it or not. The circumstances of life are going to impose misery and suffering on you, and I guess the option you have is whether you want to overcome them or succumb to them or whatever. But some of those things are out of your control, whether you're going to be harmed. Um, Again, some people might say, I'm not going to, you know, allow myself to suffer in this way, and they would take their own lives or whatever. But anyway, that's a question about how you live life and how you're going to cope with it. But antinatalism is more to do with recognizing the suffering in life, recognizing the futility of it, and then saying, hey, there's no way, there's no reason to impose these risks on another person. Um,
you know, there's this people often say happiness is a choice. That's an arguable thing. There's no argument that's going to say that it's a fact that happiness is a choice, or it's a fact that happiness is not a choice. So that's a difference of opinion right there. So the reason that even if I was atheist, that I would not be nihilist. The reason I would not be nihilist, given my atheism, if I was atheist, is because if I can use this sort of way in my life to be happy and have a good life amidst all my suffering and problems, then I can pass on this method of life. I can pass this on to a potential child were I to have one later in life.
yeah, but but what if the child does not agree with your method? You know, they're going to grow up and they're going to have their own mind. Um, and they might say, hey, life is too stupid. Well, why did you bring me here? They might ask you that question. Why did you have me? Why did you do that? And then if you say, well, you know, I have this method that works for me and you can use it, and they say, well, that's just, they might just tell you, well, I don't think it works for me, or they might say, well, this method is nonsense or whatever. I mean, right now you can see thousands of people talking about ways to cope with life. You talked about this Marcel Proust or whatever, and you know, lots of people have written books, and there are all of these strategies, and still people are becoming antinatalists. You know, people are concluding life is shit, and people are killing themselves. So when you take, when you procreate, you're taking a risk with someone else, and that you're taking a gamble. You know, your child might come to hate life. They might come to say, well, or they might come to hate you, resent you for imposing them here, and you know. So that is a risk you're playing. You're taking a gamble with their welfare. And since, as an atheist, you have to, since one of the conclusions of atheism is that life is futile. It doesn't have any purpose. Um, why did you why did you have the child? If you knew that life, there was no need for sentient beings to exist, why did you procreate and impose them into life with and if all you have is, well, I found a way to cope with life, well, I don't think that's a good justification, because your child is another person. They have a different psychology, and they might not want to cope, or they might suffer horribly. You might have not suffered in your own life horribly, but they might have, getting cancer or disease at like 15 years old, and who knows what they're going to experience. So that is the problem.
So I believe that since in the same way that it was passed to me, since it was taught to me, in that same way I could teach it to um, potential kids or kids of mine. I believe that it's possible. Um,
Well, another point I want to make is like more and more people, as we go forward, are going to recognize that life is a stupid game. I think the culture that we live in right now is very life affirming. So a lot of people are brainwashed into thinking that, hey, we can, what is the purpose of life? Is to, self actualize or have a great job or be happy or all of this nonsense. In the future, this kind of bullshit is going to be analyzed for what it is. And a lot of people right now are living under various delusions. Even atheists are they believe in this kind of myth of scientific progress. We're going to go and go to the universe and be Star Trek and all of this stuff. They think there is something out there, some deep mystery in the cosmos where really, well, atheism entails that this is just a physical universe. This is matter and energy, and we're just configurations of matter and energy. Consciousness is just a product of this brain. It's a tool created by evolution to get us to have feelings of negativity, which is provides a motivation to engage in survival behavior. So all of these truths are going to force us to recognize that this life is a pretty negative thing, and the culture is going to have to change. So in the future, more and more atheists are going to be very critical of life-affirming cultures. So even that is going to make it difficult for the people of the future to adopt this kind of self-help actualization thing. They might have to do it, but they're going to say, "Hey, this is just bullshit. I'm not going to have a child and impose this nonsense on them."
so that is essentially the reason why I don't think it's why I don't think it would be terrible to have for me to have a child later in life where I could decide that. Um, Now, in that, I'm not saying that it's wrong for you to make your choice to not have children. Um, we all have the right to make our own choices. We all have that right.
Yes, we have the right to make choices, but the right to make choices is not, uh, without any kind of limitation. I can't just suddenly say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to punch someone in the face because I have the right to punch someone in the face. No, no, I can't do that. There are limits to what I can do. The other person has a welfare, so I can't just simply punch them without a good reason. Now, if they're coming to sort of harm me, like if there's a crazy person or whatever, then I might punch them or whatever, because that's a good reason to punch them. Um, or they're going to harm like someone I know or whatever, another person, I just go and try and stop them or whatever. Um, so yeah, there are limitations in our actions, and I think you're going to talk about opinions or whatever. Well, not all opinions are equal or valid. There are reasonable opinions and there are unreasonable opinions. So we have to qualify our opinions. So if you're an atheist and if you say, I want to procreate, the anti-natalist is going to ask you, okay, if you're going to procreate, give us, defend the act of procreation. Say what gives you the right to procreate and impose a risk of suffering on another sentient being. And as antinatals, we're providing the reason. We're saying life is a zero-sum game, it's futile, evolution is their origins, and when you procreate, you're imposing the risk of suffering on another person. They don't no one consents to being born, and the planetarian asymmetry. If no one is born, they're not going to be deprived. All of those arguments have been made to say why you ought not to procreate. We're saying non-procreation is the more reasonable course of action, and that procreation is unreasonable and unethical given the atheist worldview. So, given the atheist context, it is irrational and unethical to procreate, whereas non-procreation is more reasonable. So those are the two choices you have. One is more reasonable, and one is unreasonable. So the procreation is unreasonable given the atheist worldview. So,
And I'm saying, when I say that the antinatalist argument is logical, doesn't mean that I have to believe that or do what that argument says. I believe that atheist arguments are all logical, most of them anyway. However, I do not believe that there is no God. I believe that there is a God here.
yeah, well, if you're going to say if you believe there's a God, well, yes, it comes on a question of premise. I mean, the atheists believe there is no God. There is a truth. Either there is a God or there is not a God. Both of those things cannot be true. So if the atheist belief or understanding that there is no God is true, then the logical arguments and the logical deduction from those premises is that people should not impose new life. And if you believe there is a God, and if that is true, then perhaps you can argue, well, maybe we can procreate or whatever. But even then, I would argue that why would you want to procreate if your child might go to hell? But anyway, leaving that aside, yeah, you know.
So that's, I guess, I'm not trying to say that I'm trying to say that there's an argument for antinatalism. However, everybody has their own choices. We can all make our own choices, and there's not going to be a argument which says that everybody has to do this. I mean.
Well, I don't think that's true, because if someone says rape is wrong, and they're going to provide reasons for why rape is wrong, or murder is wrong, or child molestation is wrong, if they provide reasons and say, well, you can't rape, murder, or molest because you're harming another person unnecessarily, you're taking away their individual autonomy or their personal integrity over their body, or stuff like that. Those are the arguments which say why you shouldn't do that. Now you can't say, well, I'm just going to make my own choice and just ignore your arguments, and I'm going to do it anyway. No, there are reasons for ethics. People say why you ought or not to do something, and they will tell you why you ought not to do it. So you have to provide a counter argument and say why the statement you ought not to do this is wrong. You can't simply say, well, I'm just going to choose not to do it. I'm just going to ignore that statement. So antinatal is saying procreation is unethical, and we're saying why it is unethical. So if the atheist is going to say, well, procreation is ethical, you're going to have to say why it's ethical, why you ought to impose the risk of suffering on another sentient being. You have to provide reasons for why procreation is ethical given the atheist worldview.
I think that the argument is logical. However, I believe and I think that there's a way to pass on a method to my children were I to have one, or them, as to where they can live their life is to make their life not so horrible.
Okay, if that's the reason that you're providing, well, the counter argument to that is that, well, your child may not adopt your reason for living. They have a different psychology. They're a different person. They might reject your methods, and they might kill themselves or whatever. So, and another argument to that is that you know you can't guarantee that your child is going to have a relatively suffering, less amount of suffering life. You don't. The future is uncertain. They could suffer horribly. So why impose those risks of suffering on them when the safer option is to not expose them to the risk of suffering, especially given the fact that they don't need to be here. It's only you. It's the idea that you want to have a child is in your head. There's no necessity to have a child out there in the world. It's just a projection of your desire to have a child. So, saying that your child may cope with life is taking a risk with their psychology, with their welfare. You know, people kill themselves. That's a fact. And when you have a child, you're saying you're gambling with the risk that oh, my child might cope with life. Well, you can't guarantee that. And since there's no need to procreate, this is a essential function. Life is futile. We don't need to exist. And if you don't need to exist, why take that risk? Even if it's a small risk, why take the risk and impose it on another person? Why should we do that?
And again, I'm not trying to say that the analysts are wrong in what they say. They can be they're perfectly logical in what they do. This is just this, in my opinion, the choice as to whether procreate or not to procreate is a difference of opinion.
Yeah, but not all opinions are equal. Some opinions are qualified and more rational and reasonable, and other opinions are just not cannot be substantiated, or they're very subjective or biased or whatever. You need to have when we're doing ethics, we have to provide good reasons and stuff.
And I welcome Anthony Ellis to discuss with me as to why you think that being an analyst or not, and procreating or not, is merely based on difference of opinion. Because I think that the Anthony Ellis argument is logical, but I believe that there's a way to manage this suffering and problems in all our lives.
Okay, the way to manage suffering, again, I'll ask you the question. Sentient beings, evolution tells us, is that we are simply biological need machines. When a sentient creature is created, it has a consciousness. It has these needs of food and comfort, and these negative needs, causes the behavior, survival behavior. It goes out into the world to seek food, and the sexual need or whatever we drive produces the behavior of reproduction and all of that. So, and it has all of these sentient beings, they cannibalize each other in the sense that when we eat another sentient being, we're consuming something that has equal value, that has the capacity to suffer just like us. And now psychology it has an addictive psychology, which what makes us playing this game, even though it's stupid. When you think about higher mammals, especially humans. So what was I going to say? I forgot. Yeah. So if what we are is essentially need machines, like um, why create us? Why create a sentient creature who's going to have needs for welfare and comfort? And say, well, you go and try and manage your suffering. Well, we don't need to create something and then have the expectation that this new sentient being will manage its suffering. We don't need to create them in the first place. You see. So saying it can manage its suffering, well, why do it in the first place? Why create that life? Sometimes they may not be able to manage it. That's a very real risk.
Lives, but that's not it's not for me to say that you can't not procreate. I'm not one to say that you should procreate or anything. I'm not one to say that at all.
Well, I'll say we shouldn't murder, we shouldn't rape, we shouldn't molest, and on the same level, I'll say we shouldn't procreate. And I will say why we shouldn't procreate, and you can see that mentioned throughout this video. So the reason we're saying you ought not to procreate, given the atheist worldview, is because of the imposition of risk, the fact that you're creating a need when there is no need to create that need machine. So, yeah, so there are all these arguments there as to why you ought not to procreate.
So, in my opinion, the choice as to whether procreate or not to procreate. Sorry about the plan. It's like a sprain. In my opinion, it's a difference of opinion as to whether to procreate or not. So I guess I do welcome, anti-nihilists who discuss with me as to why you think that it's not a difference of opinion as to whether we should procreate or not. I would like to have some discussions there.
Okay, so I've told you why it's not simply a matter of opinion, because when we're making ethical decisions, we've got to you're asking other people to change their behavior. So if you're going to ask them to conform their behavior to your ethical statement, then you've got to provide reasons why. And antinatalists have provided reasons why people ought not to procreate. It's up to the procreator to provide reasons why we ought to procreate. And so far, the only reason I've seen you say is that, well, the potential child will be able to manage their life. Well, I'm telling you, the response to that is, when you say that you're taking a risk with someone else's welfare, what if the child does not? What if the child disagrees with you and ends up killing their life or having a pretty terrible life because they find life pointless and futile? Or what if they end up suffering horribly, cancer at 13, 14, 12, whatever? And even if they have a good method, psychological method, they're going to still have a pretty bad life. What if they become crippled, paraplegic? You can't prevent all of this. It doesn't matter how much of a strong method you have to cope with life. Your life is still going to suck objectively. Um, and again, why do you want to create a need machine, which is what a sentient being is, when there is no need for us to exist? So those are the counter arguments to your statement that, well, they may be able to manage suffering. Well, given that we don't need to exist, there's no need to create us in the first place. And what if your child is another person? They're not you. Even now, there are lots of self-help methods, but people still kill themselves. People are still becoming antinatalists. So, okay.